Welcome to Land&Legacy Podcast. This is your host, Adam Keith.
And Matt Dye.
Coming to you right here on the Sportsman's Nation Podcast Network. This week's podcast brought to you by Pure Air Natives. Matt, you ready to jump in?
I've been so ready to jump in.
All right, I guess as you say...
Dive on in.
Multiple times every week. Dive on in.
You guys ready to dive in? We're going to dive in this week. We were kind of struggling to find a topic. Not find a topic, but decide on a topic, I guess.
There's always like 3 topics that are kicked around.
Yeah.
That it's like, well, could we stretch that one into an hour? Well, that one's going to be an hour, probably 2 podcasts.
Or let's wait on that one for a better time.
Yeah.
Like, we always have great ones, but then it's like, let's just figure on a different time to do that one.
Or let's do that one. Well, if we do that one, they're just going to laugh at us. So, you know, one that I've been wanting to do or talk about doing or try to do is kind of just overall turkey hunting strategies. But
yeah,
in a year, I mean, we're on podcast number 58 now.
58. And
doggone it, the listeners have put us in the habitat box.
Now, well, we've probably self-induced.
I said that joking.
Yeah.
But that's what they keep wanting more of, so that's what we keep giving them.
Keep on doing it.
And so the turkey hunting strategy and everything like that is postponed for the time being.
You know,
this is why I say we ought to write blogs, is because there's so much stuff. Like, we can cover strategies in blogs and not have to worry about doing it on podcast. Maybe we'll stick to habitat. So.
Writing, that takes a lot of time.
I
enjoy it, but
doesn't take long at all to write a blog.
Old blogger, Adam the blogger.
What's worse, a podcaster or a blogger?
I don't know if there's a worse.
Let's do both of them.
There we go. Why not add something else to it?
If we're gonna be a bear, you might as well be a grizzly.
Be a big old grizzly.
So,
well, honestly, that's why today we were like, let's really get back and do a habitat focused podcast. And we were both on a farm today, and this, I guess, in my mind, this idea has kind of been in the process of coming along for a couple weeks, and then it all just kind of clicked today.
A light bulb went on.
A light bulb, yeah.
A big beaming.
Yeah, it just
bulb.
It all came together. It's like, yep, I had bits and pieces, and then putting it all together. It's like, man, this is going to be spectacular, and I think that it's going to be a perspective or a way to look at things. From a habitat manager, a land manager, or a hunter's standpoint, that really, I don't know if I've really heard it talked about in the hunting world, wildlife manager world. I've heard it kind of talked about in cattle a little bit, but definitely not in the habitat management and specifically how to get the most out of the property.
No, totally. And that's not to say that they haven't.
Sure.
Because the other main podcast that talks so much habitat, we frankly try to avoid listening to, even though I think it's a great podcast. Just because we don't want to make sure we don't accidentally include their content in ours.
Yeah.
And try, because they're doing great stuff over there. So, and I'll frankly say it, that's the MSU Deer podcast.
Darn right.
A lot of great information coming out of those guys, but that's why we don't. They probably, who knows if they covered this or not, but we don't listen because I don't want to go on there and say, oh yeah, boy, that was awesome. And then it accidentally just comes on our podcast. So.
Yeah. So anyhow, if it's been talked about, I didn't know, but I'm excited to talk about the sun.
What? The sun?
What do you mean the sun? Yeah, the sun, like the big old glowing thing in the sky, and what that has to do. And we're going to break it down. We're going to go, 30,000 foot view and break it down into how it affects habitat. And specifically, we're talking about like north and south facing slopes, what the sun will do and what you will see different in vegetation, in species, and why animals spend more time here versus there. An overall habitat that can be directly correlated right back to the sun and what you need to do to manage around that on your property. So it sounds crazy. It sounds like a wild idea out there, but it's going to make sense in the long run. So just hang on and I guess open your mind too to this one. It's going to be a little out there.
For some reason, the thing that popped in my head was on Friends when Chandler's singing, "The sun will come out tomorrow, tomorrow.
Our listenership just went down.
Your bottom dollar. The sun.
What are you talking about?
It's from Prince. Hey, you can act goofy before the podcast, and I'll just go goofy right into the podcast. So before we do that,
we had people listening.
People may be going, because this week's podcast brought to you by something we haven't mentioned yet, Pure and Natives. That's a new partner of ours that we're both very excited about. Big things coming with that I think a lot of our listeners will really enjoy, kind of a new look, new techniques with that. So stay tuned.
Oh, yeah.
We're ready to get back to the sun.
Okay, the sun. So this is a quote. I'm going to read it, and it's going to kind of make sense and kind of set the stage for what we're going to dive into. So the light is given off by the sun travels in a little over 8 minutes to the earth. The energy is a major function of life's sustaining process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. Almost all living organisms on this planet depend on the photosynthesis process to survive. So no matter what you look at, whether it is an ant or it is a blackberry bush or it is an oak tree, it is dependent upon the sun and its energy that it gives off and is converted by photosynthesis from light energy into chemical energy to produce things. That's super, super important. And yeah, wake up, you're in science class again. But I think it's important to just real quickly hit on that, because it may not make sense or be relevant, but as we dive in here, we got to remember that we can't just walk outside and be like, okay, yeah, it's sunny outside today. When we walk outside, it's like, great, it's sunny today. Like, things are growing. This is an important part of life, honestly, as we know it. And it's often just completely overlooked. You're like, oh, cool, I'm getting a tan today. It's sunny. But there's so much more to it. And if we don't stop and think about it, or stop and do this podcast and talk about what the sun means for, the habitat and how it's going to affect, how big a deer gets, or how healthy a deer herd is, or whatever it may be, or how healthy your food plot is, we've got to stop and talk about it, though.
And I think it's important to know that, like, when we're talking about the sun, let's try to simplify that, is we're trying to almost manage the sunlight is what we're kind of going with, or manage the way we use the sun to our advantage.
Correct.
So too much sun or full sun all day long results in certain things, while not much sun results in other things. And that's what this whole podcast is kind of, in a simplified version. That's what we're going to be talking about, is what the sun means to managing your land.
Right. So, as we do that, let's just take a second to think about this. The animals that we hunt and we manage, we don't need to focus on necessarily specifically like what it is that they are. Like, okay, that's a deer. We understand it. We understand, broad spectrum, what it is that they need nutritionally. And we understand that they rut, they're going to, breed in the fall, this and that. That's great. What we need to focus on is their needs, not them specifically, if that makes sense. I want to make that distinction before moving forward. It's like, what it is, their needs now honestly have to become like, I guess, our needs. If it's like a kid, you know what I mean? Like, if you're a parent, you need to think about like the kids' needs, like where they're going to get their next meal, where they're going to be secure and safe. Selfishly, we need to be doing that, but through proper habitat management for the wildlife that we want to promote on properties. We need to be thinking about what it is that they require nutritionally and for cover. And so we need to take a step down from that organism level into like the vegetation level.
I think it comes down to when we often see people doing things for the wildlife, it's for their benefit during hunting season, so they can benefit to fill in tags. But if we really want to achieve the goals that we all do, which is more deer, healthier deer, bigger deer, we need to look at it from how can we provide the best forage and cover and security and everything they need 365 days a year.
100%. Exactly. So if we think about this from like a farming aspect of things, a cattle farmer, they're farming cattle, but what their main concern really should be is the grass. they're grass farmers. They have to understand grass and that vegetation because that's what a cow makes its living off of. Whereas a deer, for instance, makes its living off of the habitat, the woody browse, the brambles, the forbs, all that. We need to focus on that for deer. Whereas a cattle farmer, they take a step from the organism back into the vegetation that the cattle need and require, which is the grass. Yeah, and if they want to go
when you think about it, the phrase that I've always heard forever has been a good cattle farmer is a good grass farmer. But now in the last 5 years, it's almost sad to say, but that's whenever people start, and you just got ready to go there, but take it one step further, that a good cattle farmer is a good grass farmer, but a good grass farmer is a good soil manager.
110%.
And the reason we say that is if you're a good cattle farmer, you always have grass available to your cows. But a way to always have grass available to your cows is to manage the soil correctly, to where if you have healthy soil, you have healthy plants and healthy animals. And when you look at it from a management standpoint, the healthier the soil is, the less input you have to make. So if you have pure 100% healthy soil, you shouldn't have to make amendments. You shouldn't have to add fertilizer and lime every single year because the soil is where it needs to be. You're going to let nature run its course.
It's going to self-regulate itself.
Let the organisms provide the earthworms and all the other bacteria and fungi and the animals work together to provide fertilizer, if you will, to where you don't have to put those inputs in.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think that's basically as we're going from like an organism level down to vegetation, then down to soil, that then directly goes back to the sun.
Yeah.
Because what warms the soil is the sun. And then the warming of the soil, the moisture in the soil, everything, then makes the grass grow, then makes the cow eat the grass. Like it's a system that all works together. But again, we can take it from an organism and directly correlate it back to the sun.
Takes carbon from the air and puts it in the soil, and so on and so forth.
If your soil's not where it's at down the line, you're not gonna express, I guess, exactly the fullest potential in an area. And then so on, like with the habitat too. If you don't have the best habitat, the organism down the line is going to be not nearly as good as it could be. So when we're thinking about the sun, that's why we devote the podcast to it. We talk about the habitat because it affects all of this. It makes sense, and especially as we dive in to different habitat types, terrain types, it'll all make sense as to what we're talking about when it comes to habitat management.
Yep. And hang with us. I know this sounds very deep.
Yeah, we're trying to cover a lot to basically get down to the nitty gritty.
It's not science class, we promise.
Yeah.
We will get to your farm in a few.
So we've covered the wildlife managers need to focus on the habitat. We understand that now. So now we're going to briefly talk about the seasonal food habits of white-tailed deer. So what it is exactly that they're feeding on throughout a given year. So then we can understand, okay, what we need to have the habitat provide. So spring, summer, autumn, winter. Those are the four categories, of course. Within that, we're going to break it down to 5 different forage types: lichen, grass, mast, forb, and browse. So there's a graph, and I'll include this in the show notes and everything too, so you have a visual and understand exactly what percentage, or roughly what percentage of the time that deer spent, or the diet is consumed, with browse during the winter months or grass during this month, or so they just have an understanding.
Yep.
Typically speaking, though, the lowest portion or percentage of a diet throughout the given year for browse is 45%. So my first question, I guess, would be, as you look across your timber or your farm in general, how much browse do you have available with the right height, in the right height?
I'll answer that for him. Not enough.
Not enough.
Most likely.
And this is the bare minimum. When we get into the wintertime, 65 to 70% of their diet is on browse. If you're limiting because you're not managing the timber, the browse on your property, that's a huge portion of a deer's diet throughout an entire year. So that's huge. Next is forb. Spring and summer has a lot of forbs in the diet, and that's about 40%, 35 to 40% in the spring and summer, because that's when they're growing. A lot of annual forbs and stuff are growing during that time frame.
Spring, it looks like spring. In the spring, that browse and forbs is the same amount, 40%, correct?
Yeah.
So I think in the spring, you've got all kinds of fresh new flowers and things growing.
Yes.
Basically, forbs are growing, and then also you have all kinds of new buds forming and growing, and so there's food everywhere.
There is food everywhere,
and that's what they pick. Where, just real quick, where did this come from? MSU, you said it's on their website, or
Mississippi State?
Mississippi State, yeah.
So that's why it's so important to have diversity throughout your property, but it's important to understand the composition of what they're feeding on. Their diet naturally would be throughout the entire year, because if we're not offering that, they're not going to be as good as they could be. Okay, obviously on this graph we can see in autumn there's a spike in mast production. That's when? What did I say? What did I say?
You said autumn, which is what the graph says. Yeah. Yankees put this on there.
Fall time.
Yeah,
you have
fall.
mast. Acorns drop.
Persimmons
drop. It doesn't specify whether it's soft or hard mast, but there's a big peak in that time frame. During autumn, it's roughly 20 to 25% of their diet is going to be consumed by that. That's why hunting over those species can be good, because there's a peak in the amount of time they're spent foraging on those.
But even at that time, browse is still 40%.
Yeah.
It to me, it's like clearly browse is the
if you're not managing for browse, well, by golly, sorry.
You better start.
You better start. Today's the day.
And it goes back to that old one-liner, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. I think about that whenever you plant all these food plots, and you're like, well, that's where I want them to eat here so I can hunt them. But it's like, you can plant all that, but they're still going to eat browse.
Well, and this just goes back to, honestly, the podcast last week with Stratton Seed, when we talked about, our food plots and how we kind of manage them, that they're supplementing the native forage. I mean, this is proof in the pudding right here that we are supplementing what nature is going to provide with food plots, because we want to concentrate them into certain areas to be able to harvest them. But the bulk of their diet is on browse, and this graph is a great way to show that and show the importance of managing native habitat, natural forages, not just something that we can plant and say, okay, we're good, I planted a food plot. It goes beyond that. They're great. They're a great way to introduce people into starting to manage the land and work the land, but we got to take the next step further.
Yeah, think about all the acres we've covered this year, and sumac gets such a bad rap. It's like, I don't know. It seems very unbeneficial and whatever. It's this little straight stem comes out and it loses leaves and it looks stupid. And
you know what it always reminds me of? The Dr. Seuss book. Sumac. You don't remember seeing those like art, the drawings and stuff in there?
I didn't read a whole lot of. I'm a Mansfield boy. You read Little House on the Prairie, man.
Oh gosh.
But no, think about it this year. How many times have we seen sumac just broken off because they've just I would venture to say 70% of the stuff that I've seen sumac has been browsed, and it's like that is a fantastic food source this time of year, to where it's been browsed a lot, I'll say.
And there's, I mean, we could rattle up dozens of different types of forages, browse forages, but like specifically just browse in general is so beneficial, as we see with this graph. Again, it goes from anywhere from 45 to about 70% of their diet is contained within browse throughout a given year.
And you know what I love when we talk about browse? It's a lot of times it's just the woody species that's within reach, so it's buds and stuff. But if it's within reach, it's in that 0 to 4 foot range. So we have a lot of these understory type species like sumac I just mentioned. That it's great food, but it's also great cover, not only for the deer, but also the other wildlife, quail, rabbits, turkeys. It's just it's the best of both worlds. You get great food and cover.
I don't feel like sumac. I guess I feel like sumac doesn't get a good rap for cover a lot of times because it's great cover when the right composition with other grasses and other early successional stuff in and around it.
Well, it's great early season cover, like summer cover. Quail, it's a really highly preferred summer loafing shaded
area. Yeah.
But after it loses leaf, it's just one dumb stick sticking up, basically. So that's why it gets a bad rap during the winter. But it's great browse.
Correct. So I think we hit that home. And we're going to reflect back on basically the composition of these different types of forages and how the sunlight is going to affect basically where they grow. So as we're diving down into, we're talking about timber now. And sunlight affecting timber. We're not going to talk about the slopes yet, north versus south. We're just talk about canopies. And basically, when the sun shines down on the earth, that energy, that light, is captured by the tree. And then it's photosynthesized, turned whatever, light into chemical. But it never reaches the ground in a lot of closed canopy forests. So all that energy is way above, let's say, the game species that we're trying to manage for and promote.
It's good for the squirrels that are up there.
Squirrels are loving it. But for us to be able to benefit the most, and we see this in a direct correlation when we talk about like a roadway through the woods. When there's light that actually gets down there to the roadway, you have forages that grow along the edge of the road. That's because there's energy from the sun getting all the way down to the road.
There's a sliver of sunlight coming through.
Or a portion of a day.
Or a tree falls over in the timber. Does it make a sound? I don't know. But
stuff grows.
Stuff grows because sunlight now reaches the forest floor.
Exactly. So that right there hopefully is an extremely good visual of, okay, yes, that sun is super important for it to basically, when I look at timber, and timber's certainly important, and it plays its role as we see, and we just talked about with mast. But a lot of times it's blocking the sun from certain acres on a property that need to be more productive than what they actually are.
Yes.
And
it's like a big net.
I think of a blanket.
Yeah.
It's like, or a big shield around. It is stopping the sun from getting to the ground.
It's a solar panel.
Yeah.
So basically it captures all the sunlight and then uses it to grow taller and produce more acorns or whatever. I said it once again for you guys, acorns. But below that is just shade that's not getting sunlight.
Well, and you think about that tree. From that point, if it captures all that energy up there at its canopy, where does it put that new growth? Closer to the sun.
Yep.
It keeps growing up and out of reach. So it's taking, basically wherever that sun is coming in contact with, that's where life, vegetation, growth is going to happen. That's why it's important to open up the canopy. And we always talk about the phrase getting sunlight to the ground, to the forest floor. That's why, because when the sunlight comes down there, you're going to have growth. You're going to experience that. And there's going to be, which is basically the end result is food and cover.
And think about that from a tree standpoint. As we talked about this several podcasts ago, but the self-pruning process of a tree, even they know that below that line of sunlight where their full canopy is, below that, they're wasting resources trying to put off more.
Why am I going to try and put resources
into other limbs and leaves below that?
Exactly.
And then you've got the poor little understory trees or forbs and grasses that are just like, you dog, you're robbing everything.
Well, it's funny because like today, and this is, what is it, April 5th or something like that? Yeah, it was a nice day, but right now, currently in the timber, we've got serviceberry, we've got redbuds. The dogwoods haven't even started really blooming yet, but those are the mid-story canopy trees. why are they blooming now? Because as soon as those taller full canopy trees, the bigger ones, leaf out, they have no hope. So they're collecting energy first before those other ones do it. They're starting their process earlier because they know, or just, genetically speaking, they're just doing their job first because they don't have a chance later on when there's no sunlight, it's getting blocked. And I just think that if we understand this concept of sun to the ground, we can become better habitat managers because we're not caught up, I guess, in focusing. I don't know what we're caught up on. Honestly, I guess I don't, because
we don't look at the power behind the sun and how to manage it. I think
we have to capture it, we have to harness it.
And you look at it.
Sounds weird, but
you need to, when we manage, you need to allow more sunlight to be devoted to that forest floor within reach. That's what we want. We want sunlight within reach of the wildlife. And even when we go back to that TSI project, is you looked right across the fence, it was closed canopy, cedar trees, hardwoods, just full canopy. Mm-hmm. And in 2 months, when we're full foliage and everything's leafed out, it's just going to be shade in there. During the middle of the day, it's going to be shade. But you look at the TSI side, and even in the middle of the day, there's still going to be patches of sunlight. Mm-hmm. And that's why there was just huge amount of growth. There was all kinds of grasses and forbs and younger story trees growing there because there was energy allowed to reach the forest floor. Well, that's why prescribed fire and actively managing timber is so important, because with each growing season, the way plants and trees work is they continue to go towards the sun. And so if you can manage through prescribed fire or TSI projects, you can knock those back to where their resources that they're growing are still within reach of the wildlife.
Yes, exactly. And
trees are providing buds, forbs are still growing, because as those trees grow up and provide more, they shouldn't provide more, but they put off more shade, there's less and less forbs and grasses and other beneficial species below them.
Correct. And in that TSI project today that we looked at, like that the forest floor was starting to green up already. And when you looked across to the area that was not TSI, that still had a mix of cedars throughout that area, there was nothing growing. Basically, think about this for a second. If we can leapfrog, if you will, get green growth started in an area that has an open canopy sooner than other areas that are completely closed canopy, we can offer better forage coming out of winter sooner.
Yeah, earlier in the spring, you're going to get more forage.
Yeah, that TSI unit was a week, if not 2 weeks ahead of the area that had the mixed cedars and what was closed canopy forest. Like, there was zero green up. In this unit, there was green up already happening. So, again, we're getting more forage, more cover, basically a longer growing season in that area based on the fact that it has sunlight and the others didn't. We're basically making a longer growing season by allowing that sun to do its job and not having, the mix of cedar trees blocking the sun from reaching the forest floor. That was pretty eye-opening. And I think as we describe it, I hope it's like, wow, maybe, most times I'm seeing green up April 15th or so in my area. What if I do some TSI and next year I'll check it and see what happens. Maybe April 5th I start to really see some green up. And it's going to change, of course, every single year. But no matter what, if you're allowing the sun to come through there, it's going to start to green things up quicker.
Not only
you're just getting
that,
energy. It's warming the soil.
You've got more. The soil's warming up quicker. You have more forbs and other types of species that do start greening up and growing earlier in the spring. But then not only that, you have more of these younger trees and things that are still within reach for browse.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go back to that road system real quick. And we talked about, okay, you've got a road system throughout the timber, and what do you see? You see an area that's got portions of sunlight throughout a day. What typically grows in that? We see some grasses, Right there, basically outside of the tracks, we see grasses. And then we see brambles, where it gets a little bit less shade, a little bit less sun every day. And then we start to see some shrubs and maybe some younger saplings, hardwood saplings or something like that.
A couple other forbs grow up.
But that road system is basically a example of what sun will do and what basically is in your soil if you were to clear out all that timber.
Yeah. The power of sun is what that is. It's a great indicator of, okay, sunlight reaches my forest floor, this is what grows. So this is what would grow if I were to cut more trees through the property and allow more sunlight to hit the forest floor.
So if you've ever kind of wondered, that's the other thing that we've talked about in the past is, hey, I've got timber. I'm scared. I don't know what's going to come back. I can't see it for something else. Well, go to an area that has gotten trees that are fallen down. Go to an area that experiences a little bit of sunlight. Maybe it's the edge of a food plot.
Go to an area that's had a tornado and an ice storm come through.
Yeah. See what happens when the canopy is opened up, what comes back. And if those species are beneficial, a lot of times what we see in our area is broom sedge. We see a lot of blackberry. We see a lot of beggar's lice. We see in some areas, we see buckbrush because of cattle, I feel like.
We said this 5 podcasts ago or whatever, but those briars or brambles, multifloral rose and buckbrush or coralberry, they seem to grow better in shade.
Yeah.
And so if you have those growing, it's a good indicator. Okay, I am getting some sunlight, but I need some prescribed fire, and I probably need to make a little bit more sunlight for the grasses and forbs to grow.
Correct. Greenbrier is another one that we often see. But
yeah.
Those are examples, if you will, of, okay, I'm getting some sunlight, but we don't see what your soil, what the seed bank is like unless we allow it the chance to grow. So we don't allow it the chance to grow when you have a closed canopy forest and the sun isn't getting all the way down to the forest floor.
Yeah.
So
let's use this past couple. Let's use this one as an example. A property that was once a cattle farm. Excuse me. Once a cattle farm, smooth brome, tall fescue everywhere.
Yep.
And that is what's capturing the sunlight. It's just a blanket of non-native, non-beneficial grasses.
Cool season grasses.
And so we have that scattered for acres and acres and acres. And it's doing a darn good job of photosynthesizing and growing and expressing its potential, and was once providing forage for the cattle. You can make the decision if it was great forage or not. And that's what that ground is devoted to, is smooth brome and tall fescue. But somebody comes along and sprays out all of the non-native tall fescue, smooth brome grass, and has now eliminated that from the picture. What comes back is, in this case, what we noticed coming back was a lot of native grasses, which were trying to make a living there, but it was like trying to make a living with somebody gripping you around the neck. You're not getting full oxygen. You're still kind of suffering. And then an explosion of common ragweed.
Huge.
So it was just like, to me, it was like, sometimes you put things in your yard. For us, when I was growing up, it was our baseball bases, or we would use like doormats. So it was a little bit bigger, so we weren't fighting over a small little bag, but it was a doormat. We would leave it out in the grass. My dad would always get onto us because we'd leave him one spot too long.
And kill the grass.
And it killed grass. Well, that's what basically was going on with the tall fescue and smooth brome, is we had all this stuff underneath that was just turning yellow and eventually died off, and we just went whoop, and we moved the mat, and now we have sunlight, energy reaching the soil.
Yep.
And then boom, all that native seed just exploded with, basically it was common ragweed. So over the coming years, it'll be I guess over the next year, it'll be a question of how much is native grass and what happens after the summer annuals, like the ragweed go out and we'll see what comes back, because we may have to plant native grasses and forbs, or we may just continue and see what happens.
Yeah, in some areas, the property he's talking about came back really thick already in native grasses. It just, each spot is going to be a little different, but that's why, you can go to these areas like a roadway and kind of test and kind of see, well, what actually is in my seed bank? What am I working with here?
A couple things to keep in mind, though, is if it's a tilled farm to where everything's been turned over multiple times, there's probably a good chance that there's not going to be a lot of great
the seed bed was destroyed.
Yeah, so you're likely going to have to plant. But in some instances, like woodland restoration or savanna restoration projects here in the Ozarks, where it was always woodland restoration projects here in the Ozarks, is there's a lot of native grasses that come up.
Yeah, and I think that we can learn from, if we do these small little experiments, we can learn from them and then imagine what the habitat could be like. And then not even stop there and realize, okay, if I were to do some timber work, I'd have these species come back. But then what happens if I throw prescribed fire on top of that? I'm going to have diversity because of that prescribed fire. And now you're managing and offering things that those deer that we talked about earlier, the whitetail needs, the forbs, the grasses, the browse, the lichen, all those different things, the mast. If you're using and leading with diversity on your property and allowing the sun to go all the way down to the ground and then following up prescribed fire, you've got that diversity. So you can meet the needs that the deer, other game species, whether it's turkey, quail, whatever it may be, will need throughout in a given year. And that's why we talked about the sun today and how important it is to utilize it and understand what it does and what it feeds. I say feeds, but like what's the examples of it, how it feeds. You just showed me a picture, and I have no idea what that is. You're over there scribbling.
I'm giving them an analogy. And by the way, if you haven't figured it out yet, our podcasts are being recorded and put on YouTube.
Oh, yeah, filmed. Everything. Edited.
Recorded. That was like 1980. Skirmer. So, yes, you can check those out. And when we get into the mapping and different things where there's more visual stuff, that's where it'll come in really handy. But if you're just listening, it'll be great still right there in Sportsman's Nation. But if you're looking for visuals one day when we're breaking down a property, check us out on YouTube, and you're going to be able to see exactly what we're talking about. But this little drawing is a good indicator. So in my head, I just thought of this.
I'm looking to see exactly what it is you draw.
Picture a glass of water.
Okay.
And it's full of water.
Yeah.
And you dump that water out. That's energy. That's going to represent sun's energy. Is this glass of water. You dump it out. 75% hits the treetops, and it stays there. 30% trickles down. It's going to come up from the soil in either forms of grasses or forbs or whatever. That's only 30%. But if you have more energy, if you will, more water reaching basically reaching the forest floor, you're going to have more energy put back and growing back in the form of beneficial forbs, grasses, and it could also be in the form of healthier animals. You're going to have more food. Since you have more energy reaching the soil, you have more beneficial energy growing from the soil. So you're going to have more food, more cover, and down the road you're going to have more wildlife because there is more energy available. Exactly.
Basically, getting it all the way down there to the ground level, the rest is history, honestly. If you have something blocking it, you may need to manage it or remove it, depending on what the species are. If they're helping you, maybe it's mass-producing trees that are beneficial, that have their role in what you're trying to manage. But if not, then they may need to be removed, or some of them may need to be removed. There's too many. That's why we talk about the composition of your timber. What are we talking about? How much of this? How much of that? Well, that really shouldn't be that, and you don't need that much. So let's change it. Let's alter it so we can get more energy devoted to the right things that are going to basically allow you to reach your goals throughout your property.
And think of it whenever you see a timber harvest project going on, let's say you have an acre of mature trees, closed canopy forest, how many trees do they actually probably take? Now, I don't know if there's any numbers on that, but whenever you see like, oh yeah, it's mature timber, we see this in real estate a lot. Oh, it's mature timber.
Ha! Well, I don't know if I've ever gone to a listing that said mature timber and it actually was mature timber.
I know. Maybe it's
actually,
mature,
I know
but
I haven't.
There's a difference between mature and making money. And so even then, not a lot of the trees are taken. And then you just have junk. And that's where TSI is hugely valuable, is to where you can eliminate the junk.
They cut the best and leave the rest.
I'm saying TSI, not high grade.
No, I know. That's what I'm saying. You said afterwards. I'm just saying that they cut the best things, and now you're left with the rest.
You weren't listening, so you're put on pause for a second. I
wasn't listening, was I? Okay.
So TSI is where basically we're going to eliminate the junk and let those beneficial trees that were there, that were fighting for the nutrients and the energy, to now fully express and grow faster and grow healthier, to where you get more growth, you get more DBH, and that's the importance of a TSI project. It's just, I think of it like with corn and soybeans and how everything's manicured and they do all this work and to make sure they have a great crop. But when it comes to timber, it's like, because it may take 50 years, or pine country may take 15 years to
really get. They can't visually see the
They can't
changes.
see it, so they're just like, whatever, I'll let it grow. It's doing its thing. It's stewing.
It'll get there. It'll get there.
And it's like, if we could get there a heck of a lot faster if we would just cut out the competition. Remove the weeds.
We're impatient, Adam.
Yeah.
That's our problem.
To me, I guess an analogy would be, if we planted corn, we wouldn't just let weeds grow up everywhere and just be like, okay, yeah, well, it's gonna get there. Yeah. Like, it's the same thing with timber. There's going to be weed trees. You need to eliminate those weed trees so your crop tree can grow faster and not have to compete with the weeds.
Exactly. So. You made the analogy, or you brought, agriculture into this, and I was thinking about doing the same thing. It's like when you go to a crop field, you don't see trees throughout the crop fields. Or if you do, they plant around them. They don't waste their time because there's no sun getting to those areas. They're not going to grow. It's not going to produce a crop. We need to think throughout our habitat, what deer need, what is their crop, what should we be promoting, and how do we promote it? And that is getting sun to the ground level where they can forage and use that as cover. That's the end. That's the recipe. So let's dive into food plots for a second. And we just kind of brought it up, touched on it. How many times have we gone to a property and throughout many of the food plots, there's some trees that are left standing out there in the middle? It's like, hey, bro, that's a hickory.
There's all that energy, all that fertilizer and lime you're putting down is going to that tree, not your food plots.
Well, and there's two things that will affect basically the food plot that you're spending money on growing in and around the base of that tree. Okay, yeah, the root system is taking in a lot of moisture, but the sun is being blocked by that canopy in a lot of places. So you can visually see the differences in your food plot and the success of it in and around those areas that have trees growing up in the food plot.
Yep.
I mean, it's visual. You can totally
watch
see
it on a year where there's limited rain.
A drought year?
Oh, it's just robbing. And let's be clear, we don't hate trees.
No.
This podcast sounds like we're dogging trees. What we don't like is unmanaged trees. We want you to manage your farm, your entire farm, because a managed timber block is way more beneficial to wildlife, as well as the soil, as well as the whole environment. A closed canopy forest really isn't that beneficial.
Well, let's go back to the graph real quick. We look at fall. There's a big spike in the amount of mass that deer specifically are foraging on. And how many times hunters, I guess in general, when do we spend the most of our time in the woods? It's during the fall. So what do we see? We see deer living on acorns. We see deer living on mass. So in our minds, we're just conditioned to thinking, oh my gosh, my trees are so important. The deer need this, they need that. But if we don't spend time during the spring, if we don't spend time during the summer out with the wildlife, we're missing out on the fact that, oh my gosh, they're they're eating a lot of browse during the summertime. They're eating a lot of forbs during the summertime. So we need to kind of remove ourselves from what we see sometimes from a tree stand, specifically during a fall when there's the spike in activity around the mass trees, and say, beyond this time frame, there's a lot of other things that deer require. And that's why, I don't hate trees. They play a huge role in the mass production. But if it's a tree that's not going to help me accomplish the goals of my property, and it's left there to grow, then it's not really doing anything for me. It's not doing anything to better my habitat, to better the wildlife, whether it be turkey, whether it be quail. So if it's hurting me, why keep it there?
Good question.
I know the answer. I shouldn't say I don't know the answer, but I don't know the answer as to why it's not more of a practice for us to eradicate or terminate the weed trees, the things that are inhibiting us from managing and making a property the best it can be. Why are we not actively going in and removing that?
Because it's ugly.
Oh man, so am I, and I don't care.
If you've ever found that, I'll second that. If you've ever found yourself going, I don't know, it'll look ugly. Stop it. Stop it. Now take your hand, put it in the back, put it behind you, and then bring it forward right towards your head as fast as you can. And say, don't get that out of your head. Because there's a good chance that nature's going to love it.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Where are we at in the notes? This has kind of been one that your notes were long, 2 pages. Mine said sunlight. So here we go.
We went a little spacey on some of these things, but I think it's been...
Chasing rabbits.
Yeah, I think it's been helpful. Grasslands.
Oh.
Full sun.
Full sun. Tons of energy reaching the soil, and what we see is high diverse, high yield, tons and tons of growth.
But what we also see is grasses, they need full sun. Many of the grasses need a lot of sun. So in areas, we don't see a lot of grasses in partial shade. There's some that do better, but most areas, if you have openings, you're going to have some sort of grass growing. Huge sun, all the way down to the ground, you get grasses.
Well, I'm going to throw you a curveball because it's not on there. Where's deserts fit in on this? Too much sun. That's what happened. Mismanagement and overgrazing grasses and forbs, and boom, now we're left with desert.
Next, savannas. You hear us talk about savannas and woodlands all the time if you follow along to the podcast. Why? Because of this podcast right here, right now. And we don't hardly ever see savannas or woodlands being managed. Think to yourself, can you imagine in your head what a savanna is?
Well, you automatically think Africa, most likely. That's what I always thought of.
Not close.
Not close, no. Not close.
Think of a woodland. Can you in your head imagine what a woodland is? And if not, Google, hopefully, oak woodland, pine savanna, and you're going to see that there's trees, but there's also sunlight reaching the forest.
Put in oak savanna too. Do yourself a favor.
Savanna. Yeah, just for the beauty of it.
Yeah.
But why is that important? Because now what we talked about earlier and what a whitetail needs, I keep going to whitetail because that's the graph that we showed, but what a whitetail needs is the forbs, the grasses, the browse, the lichen, the mast. What kind of ecosystem can do that? Oh, pick me. I know.
A diverse one.
A diverse one that has some shade, one that has some hard mast, larger trees, one that has some portions that are devoted to full sun, some that have, again, partial shade, so that you have so many different types.
Pockets of young trees.
Yeah, so many different types of vegetation growing that it will occupy and support wildlife, white-tailed deer, throughout an entire year. And why is that? Because there's sunlight getting all the way down to the ground.
Yes. If
you have, let's just go right back to the mast, hard mast, there's a small section of time when they're foraging on that heavily, and the biggest time frame is about 30% of their diet. 25 to 30% of their diet, fall time, is hardwoods. So if you are completely dominated in hardwoods and have very little undergrowth, there's a very small fraction of a given portion of a year that you are providing 25 to 30% of a deer's diet.
It'd be like your mama putting one meal a day on the table when you were growing up. You got just enough, but pretty soon you start having to go elsewhere to get the rest of the food.
That's it. Now, yeah, there's other portions of the year that they'll forage some on. We get all that. We're just talking about the biggest portion, the biggest time frame. Autumn, 25 to 30% of their diet is hard mast. So why are we focusing so much on timber?
Because it's pretty.
We have to manage it to produce diverse species, early successional species that will grow along edges, that will grow in partial shade, that will grow in more sun. That will allow us as a land manager, as a hunter, to have better hunting. All this.
Well, think about the times whenever you see prescribed fire implemented on closed canopy forest.
Wank, wank, wank.
Oh yes, sure. It sounds wonderful. Yeah, pat yourself. You're doing prescribed fire. That's a great step, but you're really missing the boat. You're taking a road trip and only putting a quarter tank of gas in the gas tank. You're only getting a little ways before you run out of energy.
You run out of sunlight when you get full canopy. When everything leafs out. And you've done the prescribed fire, there goes your energy source. Things stop growing. It only gets to a certain height. Now imagine if all those trees were gone, or if you had a woodland, or if you had a savanna, you could continue that growth and continue the benefit of those areas if you had the sun still allowing to go down to the forest floor.
I'm going to chase a rabbit trail here.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Fine, dive right in.
What do deer eat the most on vegetation? The new tender ends.
Yes.
So if you stop that sunlight from getting to base the ground level where you did a prescribed fire in the closed canopy forest and you stop the energy, there's no more tender ends. It's just stopped.
Or as it continues to grow, those tender ends are now 6 foot tall and out of a deer's reach.
Right.
And it just keeps going and going and going, and they're looking up going, get back here, but it's out of reach. What about like when you see greenbrier and it grows up and it starts going up the tree, and they've eaten all the leaves, but there's this huge wad or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's what happens with whenever you don't manage. Things grow out of reach, basically. What I was thinking was, think about energy from when you look at multi-use properties. This is what I faced all the time, and I know a pile of listeners have listened or have seen this happen with cattle and wildlife. What happens? All the energy that was put in on the soil and grew up, cows ate it. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, with unmanaged cattle or the system of don't close the gate and the cattle roam free, they just eat whatever's right there growing, and there's nothing left. So that's one of the huge problems with cattle as far as the way they're managed and not rotationally grazed or moved is they just keep eating the young tender stuff that's within reach of a deer, and the deer have to go elsewhere where the cows aren't. So anyway, there's my little rabbit trail.
So we got savannas, we got woodlands. They're super important because they have the diversity. They have full sun, they have partial shade, they have areas that are growing thicker in saplings, they have everything. So that's why they're allowed to they're capturing more sunlight and more energy than a timber stand, than a closed canopy forest, and benefiting the wildlife in a greater sense throughout a larger portion of a year. Let's talk about southwest facing slopes real briefly, about them capturing the sun.
South and west facing slopes?
Yes.
Okay. When you look at south and west facing slopes, and this is really, terrain country, so we've dealt with this like crazy here in the Ozark Mountains, but south and west facing slopes get the most sunlight during the day. So during the summer months, that's where the heat of the day, that's where it's beaming down. And even during the winter, that's the first place the snow thaws. That's the hot bedding areas, is because there's sunlight. There's energy there. A deer can lay in the sunlight and take the sun's energy and turn it into warmth. And like we mentioned earlier, that's where some of the first green stuff's going to start growing in the spring. So that's where they're going to get the first nibble on some forbs. North-facing slopes are the exact opposite. they don't see the sunlight a majority of the day. And this is east-facing slope. So east-facing slope is going to get a little bit of sunlight in the morning, and then quickly it's going to turn to where it's hitting the south and west-facing slope. So north and east traditionally have more moisture below the trees, just because they don't have as much sunlight. That's why it's a little harder to do a prescribed fire in those areas, just because there's more moisture on the forest floor.
It holds on to it, and you're going to see if you're in timber country, or terrain country, and you spend time monitoring the vegetation, what's growing or what is not growing in some certain areas. Like, for instance, we see here a lot more maples and ferns, if you will, in some places on north and east facing slopes. Those dwell and do a lot better on the moister, cooler areas. Whereas on the south and west facing slope, we don't get that.
We get a lot more little blue stem and coneflower and little forbs that have really taken advantage of that and adapted over the time to where they thrive on that. You stick them on a north facing slope, and they're not doing that well. They're gonna basically go away, die off.
They don't have the energy that they require.
They're not. It'd be like sticking me in a city. I'm not adapted for that. I can't handle myself there. I'm gonna die. So that's how they are about. If you take these south and west facing slopes, these species that are really adapted to these dry soils and full sunlight.
Well, we talked about before the podcast, white oak trees. Best growing white oak trees. Loggers love to find the north and east facing slopes to get great white oak trees off of. Well, when you look at a south and west facing slope, you see more of post oaks, more black oaks, more blackjack oaks,
more chinkapins.
More chinkapins, because those are more adapted to the intenser, hotter summer, drier areas than the white oak will be.
And I had this conversation with my dad not too long ago. Logger was talking to him about walnut trees and how walnuts are really valuable right now. There's a lot, good price, and kind of encouraging him to maybe plant some walnuts. And I kind of laughed in my head. I'm like, we're not a walnut farm. Like, we could not grow them. We're just not a great place to grow. Traditionally here in the Ozarks, it's the bottom ground that grows just great walnuts. But I'm Rocky Ridge Top.
Yeah.
I'm Rocky Top, man.
Rocky Top, you always...
No, stop. So you're going to be put on pause again. So that's just, when you look at it from a standpoint, how often do we see people taking a species that's devoted to a certain site and putting it in an area that it's not meant to be? It's a problem that we see a lot. And if you can understand how the sun works and the energy works, you can use certain species to your advantage.
You become a lot more proficient.
Yeah.
You don't learn things the hard way, I guess. You don't plant a sycamore on a rocky ridge top and hope for the best.
None of those darn things will grow anywhere.
They will, but they're not. They're best suited for different areas.
You don't take a little blue stem and stick it in an area where it's going to have wet feet.
Yeah.
You take a sedge or a rush and you put it down there. And that's a problem or I guess it's something we should understand of what species grow best for a certain site and managing accordingly to where our south-facing and west-facing slopes, you don't need to be planting walnut trees. You need to be planting native grasses and shrubby-type plums that are adapted to that dry, full sun site.
Yep.
You don't plant an eastern red cedar in a prairie because the prairie is supposed to be managed with fire.
It's going to burn up.
You can if you want to waste your money.
It'll burn up, man. So let's talk about a cedar tree and cedar monocultures. I know
goody. They're my favorite.
We have ruffled some feathers with that. But that's okay, because what happens, it's completely shaded. It blocks all the sun. There's nothing growing underneath of it. Or a pine plantation that hasn't been thinned yet. Yeah. We're in one down in Mississippi. There was like zero growth. The only thing that was growing in there were
sweet gums.
And very small amount of them, and those jokers will grow anywhere.
Yeah.
And
they'd even make it on top of my dad's head.
Yeah.
Or nothing grows.
Throwing him under the bus. Wow. Sorry, Fred.
Love you, Dad.
Sorry, Fred.
Oh, yeah.
But seriously, though, if you have those areas, you are completely robbing those acres devoted to, let's say, a cedar monoculture. You're not getting any diversity. You're not getting any sun down to the ground to spark new vegetation, to spark diversity, to spark forage that they're going to be able to consume.
Yeah. It's like we don't dislike any native species. Eastern red cedar's native. We don't dislike those. What we dislike is when we don't like the species that grow at a rate to where they take up more energy than everything else. And Eastern red cedar is notorious for growing a lot quicker and taking more energy than what everything else needs. So you don't get those. You don't get diversity. Eastern red cedar is like out to change diversity. It's out to kill diversity. That's what it does. And you know how much we love diversity. So therefore, that's it was put on this earth to go, I will kill diversity. So there you go.
So
where are we at?
In a nutshell, we're wrapping this thing up. In a nutshell, we've explained the sun. We've explained what grows in these certain areas and why you have to have diversity to meet the different nutritional needs of whitetails throughout a given year. And that's the other thing that we haven't talked about necessarily is, okay, if I have diversity within my habitat, if I have areas of shade, if I have areas of full sun, if I have areas of no sun, I have diversity throughout my farm. Now, what are you doing with that diversity? Are you allowing beneficial species to grow? Because there's certain areas that is a lot open, but you might have fescue growing out there that a deer is not consuming. Cattle may, but you are basically the one who determines what should grow, where it can grow, and as a land manager, that's your determination. So if you have vast areas that are open and not providing benefit to whitetail or the wildlife, you're not utilizing your property to the most that can benefit. You know what I mean? Like how many times have we gone to a property? There's nothing wrong with this. And that's the thing I don't want to, come across as, oh, well, you guys are doing it wrong. There's a learning process to all this. Like if you've got a cattle farm that you bought cheap and you're turning into a recreational farm, but you haven't addressed the areas that are open and you're not harnessing the sun for what it could be to benefit, provide more forage and more cover for the wildlife, then that's where we need to start. Because you have basically a clear look, a clear view of the sun, and you're not doing anything to capture all that energy with vegetation that can benefit. You're capturing all that energy and it's going into a cool season grass that's not doing anything for the wildlife. Like let's start there and manage that and get it to a productive state, or encourage the right species to grow there that will benefit and get you to your goals.
The sun provides a ton of energy. It's up to you to decide what that energy goes into. If it's going to go into all trees, 99% tree energy to where it's just closed canopy forest, or you're going to let it go into all sorts of different things, which could eventually lead into the sun's energy means bigger antlers.
Exactly. Basically, that's the whole thing. If you have diversity, if you cover the basis throughout a given year with your forages and the way you're capturing and harnessing the sun, if you're doing that, the rest will take care of itself. If you're providing and meeting all the nutritional needs that a deer would require from January 1st to December 31st, his basis is covered, you are off to the races.
He's going to be a lot healthier and healthier deer.
A lot bigger.
A lot bigger. It's like my little glass of water analogy is, if you're closed canopy forest, most of the energy, the water is going into those trees. But if it's allowed to reach the forest floor, it's going to in turn go into that vegetation, which then is going to be taken up by the deer. That's what I was meaning. So
right.
Roundabout way, the water or the energy ends up in antlers and not in more leaves at the top of a tree 100 foot up.
It goes back to like that cattle analogy. We're talking about grass and then soil and then sun. Just revert that and change that to deer. You got the sun, then you got the soil, then you got all this beneficial vegetation that a deer is going to consume. The healthier they are, the bigger and better antlers that they're going to have, and for you to
more fawns that Joe's going to make.
Yeah. So
more meat in the freezer.
Yeah, that's it.
So Is woodlands,
that it? My biggest thing is woodlands, savannas. They often get overlooked. TSI, managing
talk to
timber.
A forester. Cut some trees that aren't providing any benefit, please.
Let the sun shine.
Yeah.
Woo-wee.
And what did he say? What day was it? But he said, "Let there be light."
Let there be light.
And there was light. So, following up last week's podcast, we had Heath and Keith from Stratton Seed Company, and we talked about their great new game changer soybeans. But we mentioned the spring mix.
Mm-hmm.
But we did not talk about, we listed a few things, but we actually have an update for you on the spring mix.
Is this a drum roll?
No.
Oh, man, I was kind of excited about it. I was going to do a drum roll, man. You shut me down.
I did.
Golly, I was so pumped up for that.
So we're going to have cowpeas, soybeans, lab, Japanese millet, and proso millet, milo, sunflowers, buckwheat, and sun hemp.
That is in your mixture. We're coming up with the names and everything now, but that will be available this spring.
And that will be sold in about a 40-pound bag, so it will equate to a bag per acre, and it should be somewhere around $40.
Boom.
Boom. How do you like us
now?
Boom
goes the dynamite. If you've ever tried to source that yourself, create something like that, you will be hard-pressed to beat that price.
Very hard-pressed. And it'll be hard-pressed to find some of those seeds that we mentioned.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've had to search far and wide to get sun hemp at times. So that's coming to you guys. Check them out. We'll put that link in the show notes to where you can call up Stratton and get some ordered. I really encourage you. That's the great thing about that mix is kind of over time we've designed this. I don't even know how many years this has kind of gone into it, but that's kind of what we love to do is test. And even when you were in Virginia, we were testing some of these species and mixes. And over time, this has been just tweaked and taken things out, added things to, and really try to fine tune to where every single thing that goes into that mix has a job. It has a job. It's not throwing in some seed because it's cheap and we need to add some seed. It is everything's in there for a reason at a specific ratio. To where we're going to have things growing and it's going to be an absolute jungle. And the great thing about this is you can plant this by design, hopefully in areas that are smaller to where you can still hopefully have some soybeans that aren't getting overbrassed. Because if you planted straight soybeans in a half-acre food plot, there's a good chance.
Many areas across country, they're
we
done.
Planted this in small acres, a very close match to this, and had standing soybeans. So it's something that has been a need. I mean, we've been
work in progress,
working at this and trying to find ways to get this in a bag. And partnership with Stratton came along, and it was very exciting. It was a no-brainer for us. Like-minded company and had the same vision. So here we are. We've got you a couple of great seed with the game changer. Great price point last week. He shared that at like $40 a bag, and then this spring mix. So really, really awesome stuff coming.
And I will say Heath reached out 2 days afterwards and said he could hardly. Oh, Keith did, and said Heath was so swamped with people calling about the soybeans that he was trying to answer the phone, answer emails, and basically process all those orders. So that's awesome. That they said that seed's getting in the ground this spring.
Yep.
I'm excited to hear how everyone enjoys it, what it does on their place, and
we're just getting started. There's another for you quail guys or bird guys. There's going to be a blend for
the birders.
The birders, the guys who are looking for quail and dove. We've got a blend that's specific for those areas, and it's going to be very affordable as well. So check it out. Would you rather?
This
Matt,
week is brought to you by.
Would you rather this week brought to you by Redneck Hunting Blinds, makers of the fiberglass blind and their ghillie blind, their soft-sided blind, the bale blind, and all the accessories right there at Redneck Outdoors.
I am putting you to the test. Last week we talked, was it last? No, it was the week before with old Zach Skirmer. We talked about hunting camp and just that camaraderie and how much we just loved partaking in it and just we loved it. So I'm putting you to the test this week. Would you rather take a trip to Iowa this fall and have the opportunity to harvest a whopper of a deer, or would you rather go to the woods of Pennsylvania and share deer camp, opening weekend of deer camp with a deer at the deer camp that's been around for 100 years in an old cabin? You're going to freeze your toes off, but eat some daggum good food and meet some awesome guys. What would you rather do?
No doubt I'm going to PA, baby.
Woo woo!
No doubt. I mean, and maybe, and you can say, oh, that's just
Forkies beware.
That's just because, for the fact that, oh, that's just because he's probably not going to be able to kill one in Iowa or whatever. Say what you want. It's not about the antlers for me. I want to go enjoy the 100-year-old deer camp and hear the stories.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Oh, I'd love it. It'd be so much fun. And that's what I want people
to do.
The
Keystone State.
If you're one of those snot-nosed jerks who's kicked your buddies out, I'm challenging you to invite them back. You maybe not invite them on your own farm, but go hunt some public ground with all of them and have some good time and try to remember what it is that fueled that fire for you so long ago, and get back out there and hunt with your buddies. Because that, to me, oh, man, that's the podcast 2 ago. Go listen to it if you want to hear my rant. Matt, would you rather, if you had a guy with 10 hours of dozer time, 10 hours, so it's not a long time, and you're on a new piece of ground, are you going to say start on the roads or start on the food plots?
Roads.
Yeah, I figured you'd say that. I mean, we've talked about the importance of roads so much to where you put in a good road line all the way around the perimeter and through the interior. You can burn.
I'm burning that baby down.
Yeah. You'll go in and burn and cut some trees, but for the most part, you need roads.
Roads.
You can have
the
best food plots in the world, but if you can't access them effectively, they're a waste of time.
Kicking tires.
Yep. So
absolutely.
That's
roads.
I really wanted just to stress the importance of a good road system. And to where it's not just one road in, one road out. You want to have multiple roads if possible. So there you go. There you have it.
You challenge people. I'm going to challenge people this week too.
All right.
Next time you walk outside, look at the sun differently. Think about it differently.
There you have it, folks.
Boom.
Matt wants you to blind yourself and look at the sun.
Directly for hours.
That's why I've been doing the challenge.
Just take a quick glance.
Go outside and stare up at the sun. That way you'll spend more time listening to the podcast because we know you're not going to be able to watch TV.
Yeah.
So anyway, there you have it. Next week, I don't know what we have in store for next week. Next week's going to be right there pretty close to Missouri turkey season, so we're going to be thinking about turkeys, I'm sure. But anyway, we thank you guys for joining us. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you're not blinded right after this by taking Matt's
great advice.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll catch you guys next time.
See ya. Thanks for listening to another episode of Land and Legacy's Hunting and Habitat Management Podcast. If you like what you hear, check us out at landandlegacy.tv. You can submit a viewer question right there, and we're answering on the podcast, or find us on Facebook and Instagram.
Feels pretty good knowing that from the beginning of time, God has called us to be a caretaker, gamekeeper, a manager of the land. So with that being said, don't you think we should do it all for the love of the land and the glory to God?